Hello, good evening to all of you out there today, and welcome to another special audio retrospective as we continue to dine into the bizarre films of the cult variety. I am, of course, Jeremy Brown, and I come bearing good news. This show has a title now. What? Jeremy came up with a title? Yes, I did. Welcome to Fleapit After Dark, everybody, a nighttime cinema podcast coming to you during what looks to be the end of another crazy winter where I'm at, with icy and slippery streets causing quite a stir a few weeks back. But during those colder days, it was a perfect time as ever to return to a franchise that in many ways kicked off, or more so elevated, what we know today as Ausploitation cinema. Australia got its foot in the door with many grungy, low-budget, violent, and sexy indie films that would put them on the map worldwide. Now look, as much as we'd like to cover more contemporary types like Crocodile Dundee or Kangaroo Jack, we're going all the way back to 1979 to reflect on a little film called Mad Max, directed and developed by George Miller and his friend Byron Kennedy. But it doesn't stop there. We're covering not one, not two, not even three, but 4 movies, the whole franchise, everybody. We're going to do things a little different around here. It's getting spicy. Tonight's guest is someone I've been meaning to have on the show for a while. I'm honored to be joined this time by fellow writer, filmmaker, Headshot LLC alumni, and host of the podcast Dissecting Cinema, Jacob Miller, the cinematologist himself.
My life fades. The vision dims. All that remains are memories. I remember a time of chaos, ruined dreams, this wasted land. But most of all, I remember the road warrior, the man we called Max. To understand who he was, you have to go back to another time, when the world was powered by the black fuel, and the desert sprouted great cities of pipe and steel. Gone now, swept away. For reasons long forgotten, 2 mighty warrior tribes went to war and touched off a blaze which engulfed them all. Without fuel, they were nothing. They'd built a house of straw. The thundering machine sputtered and stopped.
All right, Jake, welcome to Fleapit After Dark. How are you doing, man?
Fantastic, Jeremy. Thanks for having me on.
This was a long time coming. We've worked around each other's content for, I don't know, what feels like years now, and I'm surprised I haven't had you on yet, and this was something that I feel like was meant to happen, and I've loved the content you've been putting out with not only your own stuff, but with Laura's Wonder Bread and the rest of the gang, and it's, I don't know, I'm a big fan.
No, and it's cool now, too, because now you have an official title on the show, so I feel pretty special to be on for this show, so let's let her rip.
It's got a ring to it now. So we did a little bit of correspondence beforehand, trying to figure out what we wanted to cover here. I knew you were trying to get into a little bit more of the Ausploitation scene lately. Is there any particular reason why you wanted to kind of get into that subgenre? It's a very unique one.
Yeah, I think for that very reason, it's very unique, and I think it's because, and you can probably speak to it personally, given your own Australian background, I guess, is Aussies make cool movies, man. They make some gnarly, very, very idiosyncratic, regional, and sometimes crazy movies. And Mad Max is probably the kind of crowning achievement of that subgenre, or unofficial subgenre, if you want to call it that. But I don't know, man. There's just an essence that comes to Australian films, whether they're old or new. They, I think, have a very distinct scenery, very distinct dialect. They focus usually on what seems to be this isolated kind of working class in Australia, which I find wholly appealing. And there's even new examples of it. I think there's 2017 or 2018's Boar, which is awesome. I love that movie with Bill Moseley and giant mechanical, great animatronic killer boar. And yeah, that's from only a few years ago. So Ausploitation's, it's still a thing, and there seems to be a pretty distinct formula for it, and it's held up for I don't know how many decades now. It looks like at least around 4 decades now, going back to Mad Max. And then if you want to count things like The Castle, which I was introduced to about 7, 8 years ago. If you want to count that, maybe it's not so much as exploitative as something like Boar, Mad Max, or maybe Wake and Fright. It's There's something about Australian movies, man, that I think just are so appealing because certain foreign films, depending on which country it's from, which pocket of the country it's from, they just don't mesh with me. Like certain films from England, I can't really do. Yeah, I get maybe I'm just going to trash the English on this show. I could probably make a few examples, but Australia just has that full on. I think it has a totality to its appeal with me. I think with the people, with the dialect, with the scenery, and then with the kinds of movies they make in those sceneries. Probably just really, I think digging into the outback setting is really advantageous. So it's just, yeah, I think it's a lot to take in whenever you watch one. So this is my long-winded way of saying that. That's why I've got to dive even more so into exploitation. But Mad Max was the perfect way to kind of get back to it.
All well said. And I mean, exploitation, you bring up even the outback setting. That's even its own sort of character in itself, its own little genre in itself. The outback cinema, just that very barren, very sweaty, very gritty, very just grungy sort of outer layer that you don't see very often. You don't see like the Sydney Australias as much. You don't see all the more fancy parts of Melbourne. You see just like a lot of these more just cold, open, very just unapologetic sort of locations. And I think that's lends itself to the very new wave 70s push that we were starting to see with exploitation. Mad Max, as you bring up, like definitely probably takes the cake as embodying all of that. But there's so many other films too. You could bring up Turkey Shoot, The Man from Hong Kong, Razorback is a classic one. Even ones like Patrick, which is kind of like an Australian Norman Bates sort of tale, which has been redone again and again. You would see the genre kind of branch out. You know, you got your post-apocalyptic features, your creature horror films, and even like comedies or family films like BMX Bandits with Nicole Kidman's first role, by the way. But yeah, you know, I loved how diverse actually this exploitation genre really has become, and it still has this kind of staying power that, I don't know, keeps doing something new every time. And Mad Max, I think, resonates with me since I was about the age of 11. I didn't actually... So my parents introduced me to a lot of Australian films of the past, both classics like Picnic on Hanging Rock and a lot of what Peter Weir does and a lot of what George Miller does later on. But Mad Max I kind of discovered on my own. I watched it on cable one night at the age of 11 and was blown away. I'd seen Mel Gibson films plenty of times before with my folks. I loved Braveheart. I loved Chicken Run. I loved just about anything he was in. I wasn't that familiar with Mad Max until I just kind of wound up and just gave it a gander, and I was blown away. Just completely, I thought I was seeing just like the epitome of what an apocalyptic film should be, or what a revenge film should be. And I wanted to ask, when did you first discover and watch the Mad Max films? And to expand, did you watch them in order or out of order, or how did you first experience them?
So the way I first experienced them was when I started to become a fan of Mel Gibson, and that was probably around '02 when I first saw Signs as a young lad, and I absolutely was floored by that movie. That was probably, let's take a small tangent, and that means about 15 seconds. Signs for me was probably what something like E.T. or Close Encounters was for younger audiences back in the late 70s and early 80s. So that's what Signs was for me, and a big part of that was Mel Gibson's just masterful performance in that movie, just how human he was and how terrific of an actor he was. So then I started to go back in time as I got a little older and see some of his other films like Braveheart and the Lethal Weapons films, and then just so many to pick and choose from. And then obviously I got traced back to Mad Max, and this is where the waters get a little muddy for me, because me being a prideful American young man, I want to claim Mel Gibson as one of our own, but he's kind of a weird case. He I believe was raised in Australia, but from American parents, so he's one of those dual citizens. So I guess, well, maybe like Mel Gibson from like 2005 on. The Aussies are like, you can keep him. He's gotten in a little bit of trouble. But before that, I can see why he was kind of maybe their cash cow, because I'm trying to think of maybe some other notable examples, but I don't think you get bigger than Mel Gibson. So anyway, going down that rabbit hole, I came to find out that Mel Gibson was in the Mad Max films, which I knew a little bit about as a teenager and whatnot, knew how big of hits they were and how they spawned this kind of cult following, but I really didn't get the whole mystique of it. The first film being made for what was at the time probably about 275,000 American dollars. I think it was made for about 350,000 Australian dollars, which are going by the English pound. I don't know. And then seeing that it was in the Guinness Book of World Records for a number of years for being one of the most profitable movies ever made, if not the most profitable. So all those things put together, and then just being sold on the idea of quasi-science fiction, low-budget action, exploitative movie of a futuristic dystopia. Like it just sounds like almost a perfect movie for like a 16, 17-year-old kid back, 10, 11 years ago. And then I started to watch them, and I didn't watch them in order because I didn't know obviously if Road Warrior was next or Thunderdome. And then so I watched them kind of incrementally on TV, just casually, but they always had that classical kind of allure that really grabbed me when I was a younger viewer. Just the aesthetic, I think, the stripped down nature, the sparse effects and sparse action sequences, but when they were there, they were done efficiently, and I think the wild nature of the characters, like a lot of the biking gang or the biker gang in the first movie. And I think just, again, all those low-budget charms that when I was a teenager making movies in my backyard and whatnot, pretty much how I envision making movies in my teenage years, but on a really, obviously, professional level and successful level. So it was really all those things between just being a fan of Gibson, of films from the 70s in general, and then of these low-budget indies that brought me to the Mad Max movies. And then it was around 2015 when Fury Road came out that I decided to, I think, get a little bit more acclimated with them again. And I mean, I don't even think Fury... I know George Miller made Fury Road as well. I don't even think it holds a candle to even Thunderdome. I think it's just completely different. Maybe a symptom of studio interference or whatnot. Not that it's bad, but that it's... it's 30 years removed from Thunderdome. So, but I mean, long story short, I was introduced by just becoming a bigger fan of movies over time. And I think just kind of working my way up to that. And from there on, I think that's when I developed a keen taste for Australian movies. And I mean, I still have tons I need to watch, but I think you don't make it to Ausploitation without being a bit of a cinephile anyway, or a movie fanatic. I've said the phrase Ausploitation probably 25 times to my friends and family in the last week, and they're like, what the hell is that? And I said, well, you got a journey to make, my friend. So Ausploitation is definitely a journey, but it's one worth making.
Absolutely, and you don't make it through the genre without even at least approaching this franchise at some point. It's just so ingrained. I mean, you bring up even the almost accidental success of this first Mad Max film. I mean, I think Bruce Campbell has this one quote where it's like, the hardest movies to make are the easiest to watch. And you kind of get that sense here with this one, too. George Miller was a physician. He was a doctor during this time and was really wanting to get into the film scene after taking a couple courses. And with his buddy, they crafted this kind of loose story, originally about a journalist, not even a cop, who's witnessing all of these car accidents and crashes and just kind of like a crazy state of things in the world that is starting to take shape here, and the world is sort of crumbling and falling apart. And then they kind of moved in, excelled it to more of a cop sort of character scenario, where the stakes are more raised, he has a family, and then things kind of stir. We have a rivaling gang of crazies led by this guy named Toe Cutter, and it turns into just a chaotic downfall for all of our characters, and what starts and what spawns the idea of what Mad Max is. And I think the reason why the first film is still my favorite is that it just kind of encompasses so much
in many ways so unpractically and so in such a very clumsy and messy way that I, in a ways, relate to it. I mean, as a low budget filmmaker myself, as you are too, there's things that we can pull from and think like, oh, they probably struggled in this area, but I can see what they were trying to do, and I know that they're growing and improving. And that's always like an aspect I always love when I'm thinking more about the broad span of the filmmaking aspect and not just the story and the characters, even though those are in there too. And I think a lot of that is accidental, but it's also, a lot of this is probably just these are afterthoughts that they just kind of came up on the fly. I know cast and crew were very inconsistent with how they were all communicating with one another. They didn't have walkie-talkies on sets. They had a lot of illegal sort of traction of some of these roads and locations. They had to work fast. They had to come up with shots on the fly. A lot of this was storyboarded. I would imagine it was just hell to make, but at the end it kind of pulled off. And I think it's because it's made in such a messy sort of manner. I think that's why it sticks around even more so. It's kind of like the underdog, I guess, of the franchise, and if you can call it that.
Yeah, I think so too, and I think there's something to be said about the nature of the production that translates into the movie that totally matches the point of the movie or the characters or the overall mood as it progresses from a little wild at the beginning to, again, Mel Gibson playing Max, who's very orderly in the beginning of the movie, and then by the end he's ruined. And so I think the production, even being clumsily made, I think it's just a perfect kind of maybe the perfect storm, if you will, of a hectic kind of production where I think one of the first things I heard about it was they were going out on the highway without any permits and like filming there, and they hired a real biker gang to come out and to be involved with the movie, which I don't know. I don't know too much about the gang, if they were like violent or anything, but apparently a real outlaw gang to be in the movie, and then being made on that small of a budget, which again probably about back then, probably about $275,000 or $250,000 American dollars, and then turning $100 million profit out of that. That's insane to me, and that's something that you can't gloss over. Right? So if you do the numbers today, that's akin to, say, $1 million movie making $400 million in the box office, and that never happens. It never happens. Tell me any $1 million movie from the last 20 years that's made $50 million in the box office. I would be, besides Paranormal Activity, fine, you got me there. It just shows that it was a time for anomalies like this, and that these kinds of films are unprecedented, and it shows a more, I think, open-minded audience at the time, and maybe more open-minded marketplace, because there's definitely another discussion you can throw in here in relation to the production. Now, I don't know what Mel Gibson, what kind of circle he was traveling in at the time. He would have been about 22 when they were making this movie, 23 maybe, and I don't know if he was deep into like local talent agencies or something like that. But this also represents, I think, a huge disparity from what's going on today, is that you don't get a 22, 23-year-old young male action hero who's taken seriously these days. I don't think it's happened in years. And I think that's another part of the production that's totally admirable. And maybe a footnote in comparison to everything else, but that might have set up a lot of what transpired over the next maybe 10 years or so of kind of the young action hero, which I think was maybe more popularized by Escape from New York, with Kurt Russell being a few years older, but really only about 30, playing Snake Plissken. So I think that Mad Max, even the first one, as hectic as it was, to go back to Bruce Campbell's comment, I think, yeah, those movies undoubtedly churn out the best or most watchable products, or if you want to call them that, or just films in general, because I've worked on major films now, and when things are too glossy and there's too many chains of command or there's too many politics on set, I think it does translate into the film. And I mean, this is just, I think, the age-old case of a passion project, and when it's something that somebody's truly passionate about, it doesn't really matter the budget, even if it's this minuscule, that quality is going to be maximized.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think even attests to just the lucky elements of just style and panache and character, and even just a lot of the charisma that's given to the characters in the setting. I mean, I look at just where, like, they were able on this budget to capture like a very realistic sort of world that's kind of gone corrupt. People are losing faith in the police, law and order. They're losing any sort of like real belief in the rules and finding any sort of structure in their lives. People are becoming more and more depraved and removed from their humanism. And you got a character like Max, for instance, here, who's he's trying to hang on there. He sees the best in the law, wants to just keep it going, want to keep the city streets alive and well, but whereas everybody else around him has pretty much kind of failed the system at this point. They're all kind of broken and have given up. He has that one glimmer of hope for the first half of this movie. At the very beginning, he's chasing down Knight Rider. Knight Rider's trying to prove himself to Toe Cutter, and he's just having a ball. He's outrunning all these cops, no problem. And then Max shows up, and he starts whimpering and crying because he feels like he's failed his family, his posse, and there's like these little human character touches that I think are so well polished and give this film so much personality that I don't see, especially as you bring up in regards to today with how heroes are portrayed, how world building is done, but in a very subtle way with little to no context or dialogue. This film nails it. Like, it perfectly gets it.
And it's funny, if you were to tell somebody that, well, this movie was made about a gas crisis in the late 1970s, that usually doesn't elicit a lot of excitement. People, ooh, gas crisis. But that's the same kind of basis that there was for Texas Chainsaw Massacre back in 74. And I mean, it's really kind of, I think, maybe the American parallel, that it's something that, maybe it's portrayed a little bit more neo-realistically in terms of Texas Chainsaw, but it follows that same kind of desolate aesthetic. It's got the super low budget, which actually Texas Chainsaw's was even lower, but and it's got that wild kind of idiosyncratic, almost hopeless nature to it. And though obviously the plots are a little bit different and the trajectory of the films are slightly different, they still kind of tap into those same elements of like depraved humanity or something like that, or how man's kind of reliance on the industrial era, it being like stripped away from them or something like that, can lead to psychosis. I mean, in many ways it is, and I might have read of some parallels that George Miller might have drawn to Texas Chainsaw. I know he dialed back to like Buster Keaton films and whatnot. You can especially see that with some of the sped up footage, which is, I think, sped up by about a time and a half, maybe double, going right back to the Keaton films and whatnot. But yeah, I think it's really reminiscent, I think, of a transcendent trend that was going on at the time that was able to tap into what was going on in the outside world, but in just an interesting and unabashedly fun and sometimes horrifying way.
Yeah, there is certainly a sort of slight reflection of things like the oil crisis that was happening in the early 70s, and even just the human attitude where people were sort of headed generationally. All of that is sort of kind of seeped into this in a very naturalistic way. Even if it was intended or not, it kind of definitely bleeds from the screen. One aspect to the first Mad Max film in particular, and what kind of sets it apart and builds for the sequels to come, is that it also really does explore these grayer areas of justified violent acts of revenge against the worst of the worst, just terrible people who want to rape, pillage, murder, whatever they can just to get their way. And it kind of shows, it says a lot about Max himself, who in this corrupt wasteland that is just in the process of becoming true, it hits him at a certain point where he realizes, you know what, I fucked up. Yeah, I noticed this way too late. I've lost my friend Goose. I lost my wife. I've lost my son. I've lost everything. And now he's presented with options. Well, do I off myself? Or do I carry on and just kind of give into the wasteland and go mad a little bit? But do I still as well show a little bit of nobility here? Do I put a stop to Toe Cutter and his gang from doing this to more people? And I think that's kind of noble character writing that we don't see too much today nowadays. I think we're kind of inundated with a lot of these very self-entitled Mary Sue type heroes nowadays, and it's like you want to go back to a time, an era where a hero kind of comes to this ultimate realization that they have to take initiative and make the sacrifice, whether that means putting their own lives at risk or not. They come to the ultimate realization that they can still be a change for somebody else's life, and we see that kind of transcend in the sequels, where for a while Max is kind of cold. He keeps to himself. He's a man of few words, and later on decides, you know what? I got nothing else to lose. I'm going to help this community of people. We're going to make it to the end, even if I die in the process. We're going to do the best we can to survive, and that always plays up the survivor wanderer legend aspect that I think holds up so well with Max and his plight, with where this revenge plot kicks in going forward.
I want to know what you're doing.
The chain in those handcuffs is high tensile steel. It'll take you 10 minutes to hack through it with this. Now, if you're lucky, you can hack through your ankle in 5 minutes. Go.
You're mad, man. You think I look silly, don't you? Don't bring this on me, man. Don't do this to me.
It's the Western formula. It's the classic Western formula, but just done in a different way, where it's always like the lone gunslinger going through town. He's trying to lay low or whatnot, and then something happens that kind of yanks them into the chaos. And yeah, they kind of went that route with the Mad Max films, but again, like you mentioned, Max more so playing an active role of what part he wanted to play in this world. So keeping a trace of that humanity, and then how that reflects what happens, obviously, in the outside world and in this wasteland around them. So in many ways, it is that classic Western formula, but I do think there's something to be said about it not really transcending well today, because I think a lot of the character types today that they use are they grab the cardboard cutout of that Western kind of lone gunslinger, but nobody's doing anything really new with it. And I think Mad Max had an advantageous time where it could introduce new genre elements, very much akin to something like Escape from New York, which was a Western just in a dystopian New York City, whereas this is a Western in a dystopian Australian outback. So that's the difference between then and now, which is these characters were presented with unique settings, unique environments, and I think endless kinds of scenarios that can happen. But mostly the Mad Max films have obviously relied on the set pieces on the highways with oil heists and with car crashes and everything of that lot. So it's blending genres in a lot of ways that was fun in terms of westerns, and then maybe classic like James Dean style or like Burt Reynolds style, car chase flicks, and then where they thought they were going to take science fiction at the time with dystopia and whatnot. And then by Mad Max 2, which I kind of, or Road Warrior, which I kind of see as like the Evil Dead 2 or Phantasm 2 of the Mad Max series, when they realized with the first film that these were really popular and could make a ton of money, and they got more money to put into it, really exploring that world even deeper. So with the second film, with the idea of again, this gang going for the giant oil reserve, and then them trying to move it, and then Max trying to make the transfer, and then to find out it was a decoy and whatnot. Just fun ways of exploring the formula they set up and using the classical ones they had already tapped into, and then just putting it in a whole new world. And that's really what it comes down to, even today when you're making your own film. Anything that's kind of made in the studio is usually just tapping into something that's already been done, but independent efforts like this that slip through the cracks always are bringing something old to light in a new way. And that's what these films were doing.
I think that's a really solid comparison to compare Road Warrior to something like Evil Dead 2. kind of in a way like in sort of setting up another origin story or just kind of a new fresh tale. What's kind of fascinating about this whole series, maybe apart from aspects of the first film, is that you can watch any of them and get right up to speed. You know exactly who these characters are, what's going on. We understand that the world has completely crumbled and is a vast wasteland where everybody's fighting over petrol. It's not hard to get up to speed, and it also speaks to the visual language too, where the series also stayed very consistent. Very little dialogue, a lot of just very solid visual storytelling. We see the expression on these characters' faces. We see the plight that each of our characters are going through. We spend enough time with some of these side characters to kind of get a sense of their personality, what they're like, what they, some of their flaws or some of their strengths, with also that risk that they could just die any moment as well. I think what's really lends to the strength of something like Road Warriors, that you get to know this big band of people in this oil commune, and by the climax, I mean, a lot of them get taken out pretty quick. They just the movie doesn't take the time to settle down and glorify their deaths. It just keeps kind of rolling because, you know, time is of the essence. We got to get out of here. We got to save ourselves and reach some sort of civilization that is better than what we're living at now. I would say the second film as well has got some more interesting, fun characters. Like the feral kid, for instance, is simply just wild. In fact, we'll get into some of the theories people have, but I've seen time and time again that people keep comparing that character to Tom Hardy's Max in Fury Road, and I don't personally see it, but it's a cute little theory to have, I'm sure. But yeah, like people like the Wes character, who's he's like this vengeful punk sort of biker who's got these like red mohawk spikes coming out of his head, and everybody's wearing leather. The Lord Humongous character is just a weird character of itself. This Swedish actor who's just a huge bodybuilder but is very well spoken. Everybody just kind of like stands out even more. You see how their cars get more rigged. Everybody's like basically find their place in this world that has completely like lost itself. You know, hack their way into getting by with whatever sort of contraptions they can build, right down to even flying contraptions as well. So it's really, really cool.
Well, yeah, I think something interesting you just mentioned, that maybe Mad Max was the one to do it, because I can't think of any previous entries, because Road Warrior was, I think, 81 or 82. So right there, I think they were kind of setting the precedent, which came something of a cliche with the dystopian aesthetic, with the costuming in this kind of misplaced heavy metal look, and a lot of the characters, like the spikes in the hair and whatnot, and you know, Lord Humongous and whatnot, that I think kind of transcended into like cyberpunk as well. So I think it's maybe an unspoken thing that the Mad Max series really seems to have invented, which kind of just came from a crude design in the beginning, which was, again, low budget film, biker gangs, leather. That's really all you need in the original film, and it not really being taken to the nth degree in the first film, but definitely by Road Warrior, and certainly by Thunderdome, which to me is like the Return of the Jedi of the series, if you agree with me. So yeah, I think the second film, while maybe the first one is the one that was maybe the most profitable, maybe had the most influence or whatnot, I think by the second film, it was really establishing what is still a cliche now. I mean, you see any kind of post-apocalyptic desolate movie. I mean, the first one to pop in my head was Book of Eli by the Hughes brothers, which was about 10, 11 years ago now. And I mean, they lift that very aesthetic with, again, the leather, the kind of grungy look, that punk heavy metal kind of look that I don't know what the essence behind that design was, but it certainly, I think, captured and kind of foretold what was going to be a generation of aesthetics. So between that and then just generally, like you said, the fast pace of the films, still keeping that Buster Keaton-esque kind of influence to it, where it's a romp from beginning to end. And that's something that I can say. I know I kind of came at Fury Road a little bit earlier, but that's something I can say has been wholly consistent throughout the series. And with talk of there, I guess, being another one coming out, as long as they stick to that, these movies are going to continue to be satisfactory. It's just going to be interesting to see what kind of aesthetic trends it might still create. because Fury Road, by the time we got there, they've kind of got everything to the nth degree of the aesthetic they originally were setting up, but I'm wondering where they go next, because people still seem to be following their mold.
Yeah, and it'll also be interesting to see, where they'll still be very, in terms of each film's identity, that they still continue to be, in some ways, a little bit different from each other. I can always tell with each film, it's like a new idea or like a new sort of prospect for what Max might go through. I think that's what George Miller was kind of always going for. He didn't want to do the same thing twice with any sort of feature within this the series' time frame. And yeah, you bring up that they are going to make 2 more films that we know of currently. There's going to be a Furiosa prequel and another film called Mad Max Wasteland. The latter, I'm certainly interested in terms of where they kind of take it. Since we've seen throughout the series, the first Mad Max, there's still stores running, there's still businesses and police kind of running amok. The second film, there's still roads. The third film, there's little towns, little areas, little places where you can sort of trade stuff, like Bartertown, for instance, in that movie. And then the fourth one, it is just complete desert land, complete sand, dunes, all that good stuff. So are we going to see a new world that's just completely bogged down in the new film? Who knows? But as for the Furiosa film, I mean, I don't know what else you can really do there. That character's her whole arc is already complete through Fury Road. I'm not sure what you could do to build up to that point other than, she was incarcerated and grows up. So I'm not sure.
Yeah, me neither. But let's go back for a second, because there is a really interesting, I think, kind of flow to the first 3 movies that just the parallels I think of. The first one, so you can compare the first Mad Max film to really any formative kind of genre franchise classic of the time. You could say that's the Star Wars of their series, but then by the time you get to the second one, again, it really reminds me of like Evil Dead 2 or Phantasm 2, where it's almost a repeat of the first one with minor caveats, but with the bigger budget because they gain their clout and whatnot. And then definitely Thunderdome, Return of the Jedi vibes times 10. The funny thing about that one is the first 2 have their very distinct identity, where very desolate, very, I wouldn't say nihilistic, but more downtrodden. And then you start Thunderdome, and you've got this 80s musical number with the synths and the echoey drums. And one of the first names you see on the screen is Tina Turner, and she obviously plays one of the antagonists of the film. And then you have the village of the community of kind of almost like
the Lost Boys.
Yeah, the Lost Boys and whatnot. And it's like when they go to Endor in Return of the Jedi and meet all the Ewoks. It's that same thing. I don't know if that was intentional, if Miller was borrowing from that kind of I guess that kind of mood, which I suppose wasn't like the worst idea. Thunderdome just gets a bad rap, I think, by default, because it's the third one. It goes in a little bit more of a lighthearted direction and something a little bit more upbeat than how downtrodden the first 2 films were, and I can get that. So through those first 3 films, there's a very interesting arc, I think, that happens with tone and parallels and whatnot and experimentation. And then by the time you get to Fury Road, it turns into what pretty much every studio film of the time was doing, which like big budget, major studio action film. And it's honestly, I know I threw some minor criticism at it earlier, and I can probably get into that in a few minutes or so. But it's really, in many ways, the perfect big studio action film. And I remember people saying that back in 2015 when it dropped, that like it's the perfect action movie in every way. And in many ways, it is, because they've got the money, they've got the reputation, essentially carte blanche to do whatever they want. And maybe that's the kind of case you can make for the Mad Max movies, which has been, they've always been at the front, while still being, in terms of quality and whatnot, while still being very much a product of their times. And I think especially Thunderdome and Fury Road are the case studies of that, of being the exact type of movie that was being made at the time, but they're they're as good as you can do for that. Maybe not so much Thunderdome. I know people have differing opinions, but I certainly think those two speak to that idea.
Yeah, I mean, even comparatively with the first two films, which, as you bring up, are a little bit more downtrodden, but also in terms of look and coloring, have this much more colder, very grim sort of atmosphere to them. Just everything feels so very dirty and grungy, and are probably the first two films that use the most heaviest, or at least the heaviest on the stunt work. You'll see later on with Thunderdome and Fury Road that they get a little bit more. The technology caught up. They're a little bit more Hollywood-esque, but they all have that kind of unique flavor that kind of shows the makings of what the next one may eventually become. I did want to still cover Thunderdome a little bit here, but revisiting that film, I hadn't seen that one for many years. It's probably the one I've seen the least out of the franchise, and coming back to it for this podcast, I certainly found myself, as you say, like comparatively to something like Return of the Jedi, which is probably, ironically, of the original trilogy, probably my favorite, or the one I don't mind putting on in the background because it's just so over the top and has fun with itself. This one I was laughing quite a bit, but genuinely kind of getting like a good laugh out of it because, I mean, part of it, you're watching Max just be so just pissed off and disgruntled with having to be around all these kids, for instance. They believe he's going to be this pilot that will take him to a safe haven in the city. And, he just kind of turns their back on them and says, no, that's not happening. I mean, he doesn't even say it. It reads on his face half the time. And I liked how it's just so much more kind of exotic and warmer in terms of its feel. And I think it's a risky approach, but an admirable one to kind of go for something that's a little bit more, I guess, slightly on the family-oriented sort of scale of a movie like this that takes a little bit of a break from the much more hardcore exploitation aspects of the first two movies. So in that regard, I think it's visually very pleasing. I think it's funny. I think it's cool in many ways. I think Tina Turner and some of the other characters I think are kind of overplaying it, but I think that still lends to the charm of the world. But I wish there's a little bit more Thunderdome kind of action. I think for what we got was pretty good, but certainly there was certainly room for more. And it kind of leaves Max in this kind of weird spot because we had this long void between Thunderdome and Fury Road. As we know, Mel Gibson doesn't return. They originally wanted to shoot Fury Road back in the early 2000s, but things didn't transpire well. 9/11 happened at the time. It really slowed down production for many people, and so we had to wait what felt like, over 2 decades just to get another movie and figure out where they would kind of take this sort of scenario, this wasteland, and what it would eventually kind of become. And I guess I'm very indifferent with Fury Road. I think it's actually, I might like it a little bit more than you, but I don't think it holds up as a reflection of just the time that's come out, just being its really huge budget. It does just kind of make me long for older classics of its same ilk. But I do think Fury Road, in the time of where mainstream action films were kind of headed, it still stands out quite a bit. It is still, in essence, a Mad Max story, but it's just way more overproduced.
Exactly. Yeah, so that's exactly like my main issue with it is, and again, it's a good movie, and like I said maybe a few minutes ago, is that, so I know I had my misgivings about Fury Road, but really the thing about it that I guess just resonates with me in a not so good way is, like you said, it being overproduced. Now, with it being in development as long as it was, around 20 years or so, I think the film would have been a lot more interesting and maybe even more appealing to my sensibilities or yours if, say, it was made in 2002. I think that would have been a perfect compromise because back then you were just getting out of the independent craze of the 90s, so low-budget films and low-budget indies were still very much alive, much more so than now, in my opinion. And I think budgets still weren't going as conventionally through the roof as they are now. And even though Mad Max Fury Road, it's as good of a movie as you're going to get in 2015, is even almost today, on a studio scale with that kind of money behind it. And Miller did a fantastic job putting it together and whatnot, but it is that overproduced and very glossy nature to it that almost turned me off and almost is disenchanting, because at least the first two films, you can make an argument against Thunderdome for this. They're very stripped down, and that's what I admire as a filmmaker, as a movie fan, as somebody who likes classic grindhouse or independent movies of that ilk. It doesn't mean you have to be corny. It doesn't mean you have to be messy. But I think there's a way to do a stripped down aesthetic and a very, I think, dirty kind of movie and still capture, excuse me, the big essence or the big picture essence that you want out of your film. I hate to even bring the guy up because he's no crown jewel, but I think somebody that does that really well is somebody like Rob Zombie, who he likes making really dirty movies and really gross, nasty movies, but he gets a few bucks behind his films. He gets pretty quality investments behind his movies, so they get done. And he's a guy who understands having that stripped down quality, even when your budgets are higher or you've got more incentive, I guess, to look like the rest of the pack. And that's where something like, I think, Fury Road just falls a tad short. And because you look at like the color grading on that, it's so bright, so orange, so it feels like you're going to an exotic beach when you watch that movie. And then they have the whole chrome cut, which I never watched, which apparently was the vision for the film that George Miller had, which, cool, great. Me, I would have liked to see something a little grainier, a little bit more crude. And so maybe in one regard, because Miller was, I think, 70 when making this one, maybe it was, hey, finally, I can make something that's big, that's pretty, but it's still mine and it's still something I'm good at. So that very well could have been the idea, but I think that idea was a slight sacrifice to make in comparison to, I think, making a movie wholly consistent with the appeal of at least the first two films. But Thunderdome, you could still kind of make the case that it had those elements. Obviously, it was a lot more 80s, a lot more corporate. But I think when given that kind of creative license, sometimes the lesser decision to make is the better decision to make, in my opinion.
You even bring up like the different cuts that Fury Road had. I think there's also like a version that's just completely desaturated. It almost kind of matched that. There was like a period during 2009 to 2011 where we were getting films like Terminator Salvation or The Road that had this very murky, kind of ugly look to them, and I think they wanted to do that with Fury Road, and I think in many ways I thought it was kind of wise to opt for the classic sort of teal and orange sort of color palette, which is a little bit more poppy. And
to be fair, I would have preferred that. I prefer that over like what you said was going on around, say, 2010, 2011. I hated that. I hated the flat colors, the faux grayscale. That has always been a huge gripe for me. Like, so while I did criticize Fury Road for going very colorful, the other side of that coin, I would have probably hated even more because everybody was doing it. It's derivative. It's not appealing. I don't care how morose you're trying to make your movie. No, it's puke-worthy. So maybe I'll have to recant that statement.
I mean, certainly something to think about at least. I mean, if a director's at least trying to do something that breaks a little bit of the mold, or at least doesn't do what we've seen so much of, breaks the style a little bit, then I'm usually a little bit more open-minded. But so I'm one of these guys who likes to casually peruse Letterboxd. I can't stand the culture on there. I think it's just toxic and disgusting.
Yeah, I haven't been on it. I haven't been on it in months. I have people following me, and I'm like, I thought it was a meme now. Like, I kind of stopped using it. But what are you seeing on there?
Well, first off, I mean, I use it like strictly as like a backlog for movies I've seen or ones that I intend to watch. It works in that regard. I just kind of avoid everybody else on there completely. But I was starting to like dig through older reviews of the first three films, and this was a pattern I was starting to notice, and it wasn't common for every sort of review, but I was seeing like two types of reviews in particular. There's one kind where the critic or the reviewer, whoever's writing or blogging, would say, I just got out of Fury Road for the first time. I've never seen anything Mad Max related, so I went back to watch the original and then the other two, and they're not quite up to par. They're just very messy and well not put together. They're edited poorly. The acting is just not as great, and Yeah, just they don't hold a candle to Fury Road. It was just what I wanted to see. I can't understand how it started from here. And then the other kind of review I'd start to see was people like finding a very deep, admirable respect for the original 3 films, and then they would end it off with like, yeah, but Mel Gibson's still a bigot or something like that.
Oh yeah, boy, you gotta get the disclaimer in by the end. Boy, I'd hate to see if they watch a Polanski film. Oh, Chinatown's great, but don't rape underage girls. Yeah, disclaimer. Things you already know. Yeah. The good thing about Fury Road, at least, is that the cliche of kind of introducing a new audience and whatnot. But like you said, there is this kind of almost like cosmopolitan attitude toward the old films when you go in and you see one movie such as Fury Road, which is very polished, very big, legitimate big studio production, tons of union workers behind it, the whole shebang. So you get this big glossy production, and you don't understand at least the first 2 films. The second film was made for about, I think, $3 or $4 million, which was sizable, but still not a big budget back in those days. And I think it just shows a lack of appreciation for really maximizing the effectiveness of a small budget and a passionate crew, which, sure, Mad Max Fury Road probably had over 1,000 people that worked on it. And you sure as hell better believe if you're pouring in $150 million, or I'd have to double check the budget on it. I would assume it was around that much. And you're getting essentially A-list talent at the time. The risk and reward isn't as big, I think. I think because you're an established commodity with A-list actors. You've got Tom Hardy pretty much at the peak of his popularity, which I think has only sunken a little, but still, the peak of his popularity. Charlize Theron, who else? And having this big name property that is going to be bolstered with corporate studio marketing and has a ton of people to pay back, like it's going to be that level of production. So I think, yeah, there's a naivety, I think, to the new crowd that comes in, very much akin to pretty much any time this happens, I guess, where a new crowd comes in, yeah, and they like the new film, it's great. Oh, the old ones stink, pretty much just because they're old. And that's where you want to sit these people down sometimes, like a corny dad soliloquy on, like, I don't know, on TV, family TV programming and whatnot, and say, son, listen, you just don't get it. Back then, they had $250,000, and proportionally speaking, still made way more than this new one did that you loved so much. It's kind of like the allegory or anecdote I made of a $4 million movie today is not making $400 million. It's not happening. You can only have one Paranormal Activity every 20 years, if that ever happens, if it ever happens again. But back in the late 70s, audiences were more open-minded, studios were a little less corporate, and distributors especially. And things like this could happen organically. They were anomalies and whatnot. But I think it goes to show, I'm not saying Fury Road is going to go down and be forgotten. But what I am going to say is Fury Road in 20 or 30 years going to have, even though it's the 4th in a franchise, is it going to have that cultural effect or real, I think, culture shock in general that the first one had? Maybe even the first couple films. I just don't think so. I mean, did it really do anything short term for big studio films? I don't think so. We're 5-6 years later, and it's really tough to say what effect it's had at all. I think it was an anomaly in one regard where it was a great addition to an even better franchise with a big budget and was vivid, and it had a very chaotic picture for the right reasons. But I think those are its exact shortcomings. That's just what it is. It's not. I don't think it changed the game the way even the first 2 films did. And you can say that's a symptom of a bigger marketplace, but I don't know. I think there's other sequel films that have probably actually pushed the industry in a certain direction, and I don't know if that happened this time around.
Yeah, there's a lot to cover there, but I will say first off, I mean, based off the success of the first Mad Max, as you bring up, people were very more open-minded at the time, and I think there really was, just on a story level, that's just the craving for a hero archetype like that, one that kind of shows just tries their best to see the good in the world and wants to reshape it into something better, but has everything taken away, and shows the tragic side of that hero archetype. And that just, it transcended storytelling from whether it's like, as we've talked about earlier on, like westerns or whatever sort of Eastern films too, like a samurai sort of film. Those stoic, quiet, hardened, tragic sort of heroes are what resonate mostly with people. And especially, not to sound like a boomer on my podcast here, but it's not too far off from what we were seeing last year. Just a lot of the craziness going on in the U.S. in particular. Can
we sound a boomer take alarm? I'm not saying you're doing it, but maybe have it for like future shows when you have to slip in like a borderline boomer take. Have like a little like
button
buzzer
start
or something
dinging.
like that. But sorry to interrupt.
No, you're fine. No, and I mean, I think there's with each film entry, I think it's just a good representation of what our culture kind of was at the time, and what we were all sort of experiencing, just for fears and tragedies that were happening in the world. I think just like little snippets of that, even the style, the things people were wearing, how we got more punk and then got more trendy. And I would say Fury Road is like an epitome of where we were starting to move more culturally, I would say, with some of the more talking points that we'd see in the news and the media. Even though, and this is where I know we've been dogpiling a little bit on Fury Road, I'll give some credit where it's due. It doesn't beat you over the head with a lot of some of these, what some people might claim is like some sort of propaganda or some sort of like social issue. I would say it's actually pretty consistent with the other films in terms of just showing two characters that kind of need each other to survive. And I think that's like, just the kind of that buddy dynamic, I think, was strong enough. It's not pandering really to anybody. It's not trying to tell anything that's like super deep. And I'm just wondering like what that could potentially bring with a sequel. I mean, just where we're headed now, we don't know culturally. It could get worse, it could get better. But either way, I have a good firm feeling that the next Mad Max film, whatever it may be, is going to reflect whatever sort of direction we're headed.
Yeah, I didn't mean to dogpile on Fury Road as well either. That's why I tried to like recant one or two little statements I made about it. Again, that one is as good a movie as you get today from a studio. I mean, that's just how it is. But the caveat I needed to add was from a studio, because and to go to your point maybe about the relation to Furiosa and whatnot, I think that maybe wasn't exactly the design, but it's certainly the way the industry, or like you said, the news or whoever it might be, is gonna take that and champion that as maybe the new primary cause of these films. And I don't think that's the design. I don't think that should be the design. If you want to have a strong character, I don't care who the hell it is, just make sure it's somebody relatable, somebody you can feel compelled to watch, and somebody that can act competently. And whether that was Mel Gibson back in 79, 81, 85, or even Tom Hardy, which I thought he was fine. Maybe again, it's tough to fill Mel Gibson's shoes when acting, and Hardy's a superb actor. I think it might have just been his material there, because it was kind of a baton pass to the Furiosa character. But I'm undoubtedly fascinated to see where they take things. Like you said, culturally speaking, whereas back in 79, it was really that kind of industrial age parallel that that was dying out again, which was the whole theme of Texas Chainsaw, which was again a mirror image almost in Mad Max. So what's going to happen now? Is it going to go further down that road, pun intended, I guess, or is it going to reflect a different outside world kind of paradigm shift or technological shift that is portrayed in the Mad Max world? I don't know, but I'm certainly interested to find out.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we can only speculate right now. I don't know if you've actually encountered some people around on YouTube have posted deepfakes where they've had Mel Gibson's face punctured in for Tom Hardy, and I'm more surprised with where technology is kind of headed right now, because a lot of these indie CG artists who are just putting their name out there seem to be doing a pretty scary good job of kind of hitting that uncanny valley point where it's like anything can happen. These films can get rewritten, and I don't know. I go down those rabbit holes sometimes where I see just all the potential of where these films get hype-rated to look like something else. But that's just a separate tangent. I did want to kind of pick your brain a little bit about what you think of George Miller as a director, his filmography, and what do you think? Do you think he still has got it in him for a couple more films, and if he could bring something kind of new and layered, or is he kind of, in a way, maybe sold out a little bit to the Hollywood enterprise and has kind of enjoyed making films now on higher budgets rather than something that's a little bit more, you could say in many ways, personal to him? I'm not saying that Fury Road wasn't personal to him as well, but it certainly had a little bit more of a much more intimate quality.
Well, I mean, first things first, George Miller is 76 years old, and he's somebody that, I don't know if he's sold out per se to the major system. I think he's used it to great financial advantage. I mean, just look at the box office numbers of Fury Road, and then Happy Feet. Like, of all people, George Miller, director of the Penguin movies, Happy Feet. So I think he's just a good case study in terms of what kind of trajectory the industry can offer, especially to somebody of his time back in the late 70s, and him being, a young man at the time and whatnot. But I think and there's parallels today that you can make, but there might not be any as strong as the 70s. Oh yeah, not to mention he did Babe, Pig in the City. Like,
yeah.
This dude has quite the library, because he's got all these different entries in the Mad Max series. He's got the Twilight Zone movie from 1983. He did not murder those Vietnamese children, by the way. He did the one. He did The Nightmare at 20,000 Feet, which that was one of the good ones of that movie, where nobody died.
Yeah, thank God.
So yeah, and then we've got, again, the Happy Feet movies. He did 2 of them, and then he did, so the Mad Max films and whatnot. So this is a guy that I think has had a tenure that, again, is very symbolic of the kind of career you can have when you make waves as an independent filmmaker and then kind of get sucked up into the studio system. He doesn't have such an expansive library that he's a guy that's taken everything thrown at him, but it's fascinating to see him direct films like Babe or Happy Feet and whatnot. And I think maybe that speaks to when maybe certain directors have to take works for hire because they're typecast, or maybe they're seen as only one kind of director. But it's also tough for me to really kind of put my thumb on if he's got the chops to really stick it out much longer and make films of superb quality. I mean, he did it 70 years old with Fury Road. I mean, I'm kind of walking back everything I said about it. It's not as good as the other ones, okay? That's my verdict. But he made it very competently. But by the time this Furiosa film comes out, and let me see how we're looking on that. It's still in pre-production. He's going to be almost 80 years old now, unless he's in like Clint Eastwood kind of shape. That means he'll be about 78 maybe when this Furiosa film is out. And if he's doing another Mad Max, 80? There's very few that can hang in there. So unless he's got, I don't know, unless he's got like whatever they're doping up Joe Biden with, some like B12 times like 2,000 a day shots or something like that. It's going to be very interesting to see if he can stick this out competently, because again, given his library, it looks to me like there was a lull there where he maybe just couldn't find stuff that he was meshing with, or it was tough to get him in jobs at the time, so it looks like he took works for hire. But again, not to speak in circles, I think I wouldn't say sellout is the term I'd use. I would say he got absorbed into this corporate system and looked like he didn't have a lot of autonomy. And I think that's really the thing going on here. It doesn't look like he was making a lot of his own movies by his own volition. I know he was producing a few. He's got a couple dozen producer credits, but maybe there was some difficulty for him to get his own projects off the ground. And even a guy who's made as much money in the industry as he has, he had to go and he had to make Babe, Pig in the City, and he had to make Happy Feet 1 and 2 to make his own movies again. So I think that can maybe be something of a cautionary tale to young directors out there that might break through, and be wary that they're not always going to get that kind of autonomy, even if they do a great job. Like, I don't want to go too long on this tangent, but like the dwarf star I see in the industry right now is somebody like Ryan Coogler, who I think was making, he was doing a great job making smaller films. He did Fruitvale Station, which I know a lot of people love. That was big in the festival circuit and whatnot. Then he goes on to make Creed, which was fantastic in my opinion, and a box office hit, made for relatively cheap money, maybe about $30 million or whatnot, and then instantly gets sucked right into the Marvel world. I don't see him getting out. I think he's trapped. Sure, he's going to have the money, he's going to get the big salary, he's going to have the giant house in Malibu and whatnot, but I see him as a guy who's not going to be able to make his own movies for a long time. And I think if you're a passionate filmmaker, if you're less a Michael Bay and then more so, let's say, less a Michael Bay and more so a George Miller, I guess so.
Sure.
Once you get sucked into that corporate way of doing things, it seems like it's hard to get out of it. And it seemed like that was the case for him. He's been in the business over 40 years now.
I'd bring up another example too, where it's like I hope in some ways he doesn't go this route, but there's always the possibility he can. But someone like a Jim Cummings type who, comes out with something like Thunder Road. I was about to say Tropic Thunder for some reason. Something like that, or The Wolf of Snow Hollow, where he's still kind of keeping to these very much independent routes and is trying to be a voice for many other independent filmmakers who also kind of want to build an audience but not necessarily join that corporate route, which might suck you into a world where you just don't have as much creative control. And I always got the sense, I think, like you say, I wouldn't call George Miller a sellout to that extent. I think he has enough of his voice in even something like Fury Road to the point that he even cast Hugh Keays-Byrne to play the villain again as Imerton Joe. I mean, I think that's just a cool little touch that he would get to bring back and work with his friends and his peers that he kind of grew up with. I think there's like enough balance of kind of control there. Producers want this, but you can have some of this, George, and we'll work something out. We'll find some sort of compromise. Yeah, I think we see this all too often with a lot of up-and-coming directors, but it is fascinating to see the ones who still cling to their roots and still, even if they go on a higher budget, even if they explode to some level, the ones that still keep a little bit of that consistent nature that we've known this franchise for, I think that still is immeasurably fathomable and admirable. And, I think still kind of gives every film in this franchise a unique quality. But I would say to kind of close here, do you have a favorite of the four films? I know you probably don't like Fury Road as much, but of the four, is there a favorite of yours that you really think cements Mad Max?
Well, part of me would love to say the original, just because of everything I think it does, and just its quality, its filmmaking, its low budget essence, its very 70s-esque style. I think that's the easiest answer, but I don't want to take the easiest answer, even if I almost exactly feel that way, almost completely genuinely. I'm going to go with Road Warrior, just because I think it's the epitomized version of that vision, and it still stays true to all those qualities from the original film. It just has a little bit more of a budget, so they can get a big truck and they can flip it, and a little bit more stunt work and whatnot. I think I'm going to go with Road Warrior just based on that merit. On my own sensibilities, the cliche is always, the original's the best. Well, of course it's the best, but which one are you going to go with if you've got to watch one right now? I'll go with Mad Max 2, because again, it has everything that's great from the first movie, but is able to do just a little bit more with the money it was allotted, and again, the pace, the set pieces, everything is great. It's like I said, it's like Phantasm 2 or Evil Dead 2 of its own series, where it's essentially the same movie, more or less. Obviously, Max in the first film is good cop that's ruined by the end, but in many ways it's essentially the same film, and revisits I think, a lot of what it was setting up in the first film, of course. So I'm going to stick with that. Maybe it's not the most popular answer. Maybe it is, but I think it's also not the easiest answer. So that I'm going to say number 2. What about you?
I would probably agree in terms of quintessential viewing for what Mad Max ultimately represents. Has enough of that action, that panache, that really just rough, gritty style that it became so well known for, that inspired so many other films and comic books and games and music even, and really popularized a very, very niche subgenre that has only grown exponentially since then. If you want, just quintessential Mad Max, Road Warrior will completely deliver on that. Personal favorite, I still would stand by Mad Max. It is an easy choice. That's just a very much more sentimental film for me, and it was my real first introduction and exposure to that character and the world. But yeah, I would agree with the same.
Yeah, well, I can't blame you. That's why I didn't do it, because it's just such an obvious answer. So I was like, go with the second one. But the first one is, those efforts always get like brownie points with me. Whether it's something like, say, John Carpenter's Halloween, which is, everybody says, well, duh, the first. But it's, yeah, that. But then for somebody like me, I'm like, well, dude, they made it for $325,000, which is essentially what Mad Max was made for. So that stuff always wins brownie points with me, and almost by default always makes something my favorite. But for that very reason, I'm gonna skirt it this time and say the second one is where I'm gonna place my flag on the hill and die there.
Sure. And I'll end it here by saying that my one major flack with this whole franchise is Max's last name, Rockatansky. I don't know. It's an annoying last name to say for me, and that's saying a lot given that we have other characters named, Wes, the Blaster Master, Auntie Entity, and then, oh no, Rockatansky. That just crosses the line for me. I don't know why. That's just.
Is it something you have something against Polish people? Maybe.
Perhaps.
I have some half Polish relatives that would be very upset. So that's a lot with some interesting names. Wozniak, for one. That sounds like a Mad Max name. That relatives' last names of mine. Polish people, very, very funny people. Maybe Polish exploitation will be next.
In the fullness of time, I became the leader, the chief of the great northern tribe, and a road warrior. That was the last we ever saw of him. He lives now, only in my memories.
Well, thank you, Jake, so much for coming on. This was like an absolute pleasure to have you just join in and just talk Mad Max for, I guess, a little bit over an hour now, I think is where we're clocking in. Is there anything you would like to plug for the listeners out there who aren't very familiar with your work or what you do?
Well, first of all, I want to say it was pretty fun, man, just getting on talking about some quality movies. I haven't done a podcast in a little while with anybody, so it's always fun to revisit a few. I need excuses to rent movies more often, to buy movies more often. So any excuse is great. And then just obviously chumming it up on this show, fantastic. In terms of me plugging stuff, so I work pretty closely with a whole Headshot LLC gang, like Low Res, Wonder Bread, and whatnot. So anybody that doesn't know me or know that gang, check us out. I actually just wrote a first draft of a feature. Hopefully the next one we're going to all shoot together maybe later this year. I've got to do a couple more drafts on that. I'm trying to spin a number of webs in the background of our typical operations. So I've got that going. Watch a couple movies that I worked on recently, or that have come out lately. I worked on the Netflix film I Care a Lot. It actually came out way better than I thought it was going to be. I was on the crew for that, and then I was on the crew for an upcoming film called The Seventh Day, which is a horror film, which that comes out in theaters and exclusive to Redbox, I think.
That's got Guy Pearce in it, right?
Yeah, Guy Pearce, Keith David, Stephen Lang, and that one comes out on the 26th of this month. So if you can get to a theater, that's going to be my first time in the theater in like a year, which I regret wholly. And if you want to just watch it on Redbox, grab it there too. So yeah, a few things, but yeah, again, more to come.
Perfect. Well said. You can also follow me over at Jeremobi on Twitter. I am also on Facebook.com/FilmChow Productions. That's coming together. You can also, if you wanted to follow me on Letterboxd, my name is also Jeremobi on there. I'm only there quickly just to crank out a review, maybe say something sardonic, and then I log out.
Fair warning. Goodbye.
All right, take care, guys. Good night.
See ya.